I should have never gone back to the mountains of Colorado in the summer of 1998, but there are places that refuse to let you leave them behind, places that grip you with a story older than memory and whisper it in your ear until you finally give in and return. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college, restless and eager for adventure. And when I heard that a small group of hikers was organizing a trip into the Sangre de Cristo Range near Crestone, I didn't hesitate to join. What none of us realized then was that this wasn't going to be just another hike. It would be the kind of story that burns itself into your bones, the kind you never stop telling because you need to convince yourself it truly happened. People often talk about the beauty of those mountains, their sharp ridgelines that cut into the sky, the way the dawn turns the stone a blood-red color, and the long shadows that make every gully seem like a doorway to somewhere else. But few dare to talk about the legends that live there, legends so old that even the native Ute people passed them down with warnings rather than explanations. I first heard about them from an old ranger named Thomas Keller, who told us one evening around a fire at the trailhead that these peaks were once called the mountains that sleep. According to him, the Ute believed that certain places in the range were thresholds between the waking world and something else, something just beyond human comprehension. He leaned in closer as he spoke, his voice almost a whisper, and said that sometimes people went missing in those places, not lost in the ordinary sense, but swallowed by the silence itself. That night, his words lingered in my mind, carried on the wind that rushed through the valley, and I remember feeling a chill despite the heat of the flames. When dawn came, we set out anyway, laughing off the unease, because that's what you do when you're young and trying to prove yourself against the wilderness. But Keller's words were the first seed of the dread that would grow inside me over the days that followed. We were 6 in total: myself, Daniel Reeves, a photographer from Santa Fe, his sister Claire, who had studied folklore at the University of New Mexico, a geologist named Mark Turner, a quiet local named Alex Gray, who claimed he knew secret paths in the range, and Rachel Moore, a grad student from Denver who was writing about the history of ghost towns in Colorado. It was an odd mix of people, strangers mostly, but that seemed part of the charm. We were explorers in the purest sense, each bringing our own reasons for being there. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and the silence around us deeper. There's a particular kind of silence in the Sangre de Cristos that feels almost physical, like the land itself is listening. Even the birdsong seemed rare, and more than once I caught myself turning suddenly, convinced someone was behind me, only to find the trail empty. The locals we met on our way had warned us not to wander off the marked paths, especially near the Red Gulch and Willow Lake. The land remembers, one old man said at a gas station in Alamosa, and it doesn't forgive those who disturb it. We laughed politely at the superstition, but Claire, with her background in folklore, seemed fascinated. She told us of an old tale she had studied, a story of the echoing woman said to haunt those valleys. According to the legend, long before European settlers came, a woman had vanished into the mountains after following a strange sound that only she could hear. Her people searched for weeks, but when they called her name across the ridges, what came back was not an echo but her own voice calling theirs, urging them deeper into the wilderness. None returned. Claire said the story might have been a metaphor for the dangers of disorientation in the high country, but as she spoke, I noticed Alex glance nervously at the tree line, as though the legend struck something deeper in him. He muttered that people still vanish here every year, and that sometimes their bodies are never found. By the third day, the strangeness became harder to ignore. The compass Mark carried seemed to falter at odd moments, swinging wildly before settling again. At night, when we camped near the Alpine lakes, I would wake with the unshakable feeling that something had passed near our tents, something that moved without sound. Daniel laughed it off, saying I was letting Keller's ghost stories get to me, but Rachel admitted she too had felt watched. And then there were the echoes. During a rest near a sheer rock wall, Claire tried calling out just for fun, and the echo that returned was wrong. It was delayed, warped somehow, like a voice stretched too thin, and instead of bouncing back her own words, It seemed to carry new ones that none of us could quite make out. Mark insisted it was just the acoustics, but his voice shook as he said it. That night by the fire, Alex finally told us something that made the hair on my arms rise. He said his grandfather had been a guide in these mountains in the 1950s, and that once, after leading a group near Willow Lake, only half returned. The others had gone to explore a side path, and when they didn't come back, the search parties never found a trace. It's the mountains that choose, his grandfather had told him, not us. The next morning, as we packed up and prepared to climb toward one of the high passes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into a story that had been waiting for us long before we ever set foot on the trail. And if I had known then what was to come, I might have turned back, but the pull of the unknown was stronger than my fear, and so we climbed higher into the sleeping peaks, unaware of how quickly they would wake. By the time we reached the fourth day of the trek, the landscape had shifted into something that felt almost otherworldly. The dense forests of pine and aspen gave way to windswept alpine meadows dotted with strange stone formations that looked too deliberate to be natural, as though someone, or something, had arranged them centuries ago and left them to crumble with time. Rachel pointed out that some of the stones resembled cairns, markers often used to guide travelers, but their placement made no sense. Instead of marking a safe passage, they seemed to circle around empty spaces, enclosing nothing but grass and wind. Claire was entranced, scribbling furiously in her notebook, while the rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. That was the first moment I realized we weren't just walking through the mountains. We were being led deeper into their memory. That night, camped near Willow Lake, the air was thin and cold, and the moon reflected off the water in a way that made it glow unnaturally bright, like a mirror turned toward another sky. We sat in silence longer than usual, each lost in our own thoughts, until Alex broke it with a story his grandfather had once told him. He said that the Ute spoke of certain nights when the mountains remembered aloud, when voices would ride the wind and carry with them the weight of those who had disappeared. Alex's grandfather had claimed to hear them once while hunting alone, soft, indistinct words rising from the rocks themselves, as though the stone had become a mouth. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, but sitting by that lake, I couldn't help but feel we were sitting inside a story that was older than us all. Later that night, I woke again, but this time it wasn't the feeling of being watched. It was the sound of someone calling my name. My heart froze in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear. The others were asleep, their breathing steady, but beyond the edge of the firelight, carried faintly on the wind, I heard it again. Eli. The voice was low, almost gentle, and yet it carried an urgency that pulled at me like a rope. Against every instinct, I stood, clutching my jacket around me, and took a few steps toward the dark ridge. The voice came again, closer, but now it didn't sound like my name. It sounded like a fragment of a sentence I couldn't quite understand. I stopped at the tree lean, trembling, and the silence swallowed it. In the morning, I told no one. As we climbed higher the following day, strange patterns began to emerge in the land around us. Mark, the geologist, was the first to notice that the rock strata didn't align the way they should. "It's like the mountain folds over itself," he muttered, tracing the ridges with his finger. "This shouldn't be possible." Daniel joked that maybe the mountain was playing tricks, but no one laughed. Even the air seemed wrong. Moments of absolute stillness followed by sudden gusts that howled through the passes like a scream. Claire insisted she could hear words in them, though no one else could. She said they were in a language she didn't recognize, but the cadence reminded her of chants she had once studied from Pueblo rituals. By the sixth day, the atmosphere among us had shifted completely. We spoke less, moved faster, and looked over our shoulders more often. Daniel still tried to keep spirits up with humor, but his laughter grew brittle, and I caught him once staring into the forest with a look of naked fear. That afternoon, as we crossed a narrow pass above a steep drop, Rachel suddenly stopped and pointed. Far below, on a ledge that looked unreachable by any path, there stood a figure. It was small in the distance, indistinct, but human-shaped. None of us could make out features, but we all saw it. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there as though waiting. Mark called out, but the figure gave no response. We looked away only for a moment, and when we turned back, it was gone. That night, tension crackled in the air as we argued about what we had seen. Mark said it must have been a trick of the light. Rachel swore she saw it turn its head, and Alex grew pale and quiet, refusing to say more than a few words. Finally, Claire broke the silence by telling us about another legend she had once studied, something called the Watcher in the Pass. It was said to be a spirit bound to the mountains, not malicious but not merciful either, whose presence meant that travelers had wandered too far into places where they did not belong. I lay awake long after the fire had died, staring at the stars above, and I thought about what Alex had said earlier, that it's the mountains that choose, not us. And I began to feel, with growing certainty, that whatever had been watching us since we began was not going to let us leave untouched. The seventh day began with a silence so heavy it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on us as we broke camp and prepared to climb toward the highest ridge above Willow Lake. The morning sky was an unnatural shade of gray, though there were no clouds, only a haze that blurred the horizon as if the world were folding inward. None of us spoke much, and even Daniel had lost his usual bravado. We moved in a tight line, every footstep echoing louder than it should have, until the trail curved sharply and opened into a basin that looked untouched by time. There were more of the strange stone formations here, arranged in spirals that led toward the center where a solitary boulder stood upright, like an altar. Claire was the first to approach, her face pale with awe, and she whispered that she had read descriptions of places like this, ritual grounds where the boundary between worlds was believed to be thinnest. The rest of us hesitated, but Alex seemed drawn forward against his will, his hands trembling as though remembering something passed down through blood. When he placed his palm against the standing stone, the air changed. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath us, subtle at first, but growing stronger until it buzzed in my chest and teeth. Then came the echo, rolling across the basin like a voice. But it wasn't ours. It was layered, countless voices overlapping, rising and falling in tones that carried both sorrow and command. Rachel screamed, covering her ears, and Daniel grabbed her arm to pull her away, but the voices didn't stop. They grew sharper, resolving into words none of us could recognize, yet somehow feel. It was as though the mountain itself was speaking through the stones, through us. Mark shouted that we needed to leave, but when we turned toward the pass, the way back looked different. The trail we had climbed was gone, swallowed by a slope of jagged rock that hadn't been there before. Panic rippled through the group, but Alex stood rooted, his eyes wide, whispering under his breath. I caught fragments. He was repeating something his grandfather had once told him, something about the mountains remembering what had been taken from them. Then, without warning, he collapsed. We rushed to him, but when I knelt beside him, I saw his eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids, as though he were dreaming while awake. His lips kept forming words that were not his own, guttural syllables that echoed faintly in the air as though carried away by invisible mouths. Suddenly, Claire screamed. She was pointing toward the ridge, and when I followed her gaze, my blood ran cold. There, just above us on the rocks, stood the same figure we had seen days before. This time, it was closer, clear enough that I could see its outline against the gray sky. It was tall, draped in something that clung to its body like shadow, and though I could not see a face, I felt its gaze burn into me. It didn't move, didn't advance, only watched. But as it watched, the voices in the basin grew louder, converging into one sharp cry that split the air and sent birds scattering from the cliffs. Alex jolted awake with a gasp, his face pale as death, and whispered, "It wants one of us." His words froze us all. The wind rose suddenly, whipping through the basin, carrying with it fragments of whispers that tugged at our minds like hooks. Rachel clutched her head, shouting that she heard her mother's voice calling her, though her mother had been dead for years. Mark dropped his pack and staggered toward the edge, muttering something about finding the way home. Daniel and I lunged to stop him, barely pulling him back before he stepped off into the void below. The figure above us shifted, and though it never moved closer, the sense of inevitability grew, as if the mountain had already decided how this would end. We stumbled back from the stone circle, half carrying Alex, half dragging Rachel, desperate to find another path. And then, as though mocking us, the trail revealed itself again. Clear, simple, leading upward toward the ridge. None of us questioned it. We climbed. The ascent was brutal, the air thinning with every step, but fear drove us higher until we reached the crest. From there, the view should have been magnificent, but instead of valleys and peaks stretching endlessly, we saw only haze, rolling like an ocean with no shore. Claire collapsed to her knees, crying that we had crossed into the wrong place, that we weren't supposed to see this. And in that moment, I believed her. The figure stood once more, this time at the far end of the ridge, waiting. It raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed back toward the basin we had left. Behind us, carried on the wind, the voices rose again, louder now, calling our names. One by one. I don't remember who started running first. Maybe it was Rachel, maybe it was me. But once one of us broke, the rest followed, stumbling down the ridge as though escape were still possible. The voices chased us, not with footsteps, but with the weight of sound, rolling over the rocks and pressing into our skulls until thought itself felt like it was shattering. I looked back once and saw that the figure hadn't moved, still standing at the ridge with its arm outstretched, as if it had already marked us. Somehow, through blind panic and instinct, we made it back to the treeline, our lungs burning in the thin air. The voices weakened there, fading into the background of the wind, but the dread never left. By dusk, we had found a narrow gully that seemed to lead toward lower ground, and we followed it in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. When we finally stopped to rest, huddled together in the dark, the group was broken. Rachel sat rocking, whispering her mother's name. Mark stared at nothing, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Claire clutched her notebook like it was the only anchor she had left. Alex was worse. He had grown feverish, mumbling fragments of the same strange language, and when I tried to wake him, he only looked at me with glassy eyes and said, "They're not done." None of us slept that night. The forest groaned around us, branches bending though there was no wind, and once, in the distance, I heard what sounded like a woman calling. The next morning, we found our way back to a recognizable trail, though I couldn't say how. It was as if the mountain had grown tired of us, or perhaps had decided that what it wanted, it had already taken. We moved like ghosts, our bodies present but our minds elsewhere. By the time we stumbled into a ranger station 2 days later, we must have looked half mad. The ranger on duty, an older man named Peter Lawson, listened patiently as we tried to explain, though our words came out broken, contradictory. He finally stopped us with a raised hand and said quietly, "You don't need to tell me. I've heard it before." He wouldn't elaborate, only advised us to rest and not speak of it too loudly in town. "The mountains remember," he said, echoing Alex's grandfather. "And they don't like being spoken for." Of the 6 of us who had set out, none of us were the same afterward. Daniel never laughed the same way again, his humor stripped of warmth. Rachel dropped out of graduate school within a year and moved back to Ohio, where she lives in near isolation. Mark returned to geology but avoided the Sangre de Cristo range for the rest of his career, refusing even to discuss it with colleagues. Claire published nothing about the trip, though I know she filled hundreds of pages in her notebook. When I asked her once why she wouldn't share, she said only, "Some stories are meant to stay in the mountains." And Alex, he never recovered. He suffered seizures in the months that followed and was eventually hospitalized. He claimed the voices still spoke to him at night, calling his name, reminding him of the promise he believed he had made on that ridge. He died in 2002, alone in a small clinic in Santa Fe. I have carried this story for years, unsure whether to tell it, unsure whether by speaking I am breaking some unspoken pact with the peaks. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure on the ridge, pointing back toward the basin, and I hear the echoes of our names rising on the wind. I've read the missing persons reports, too many vanishings in those mountains, year after year, always with no explanation. Officially, they are accidents, missteps on dangerous terrain, exposure to the elements. But I know the truth is more complicated. The Sangre de Cristo Range is not just mountains and stone. It is memory, hunger, and something older than we can name. And I believe what the Ute once said, that the peaks are sleeping, and when they wake, they remember every footstep, every voice, every trespass. If you ever find yourself near Crestone, if you ever feel the pull of those blood-red ridges at dawn, I beg you, listen to the silence. It is not empty. It is the sound of the mountains waiting.